A tension in the air. It was another blistering Saturday afternoon at Henderson Park, the sun hanging high above, casting long, sprawling shadows on the cracked pavement. The park, usually a peaceful place of leisure, was alive with the sounds of families, friends, and children laughing in the warm summer breeze. The basketball court, with its faded lines and netless hoops, buzzed with the energy of teenagers. Sneakers squeaked across the pavement in rhythm with the steady thumping of the basketball, while their shouts of competition and joy echoed against the quiet hum of the surrounding city. Yet, beneath the surface of this vibrant scene, an invisible tension lingered. Something was in the air, a flicker of uncertainty, as though the calm before a storm. Today, something was about to happen, something that would alter the course of this peaceful afternoon. Officer Martin stood at the edge of the park, watching the activity unfold. Tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform was pressed and pristine, an almost comical contrast to the unrefined surroundings of the park. His posture was stiff, and his eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, seemed to scan the crowd, searching for any hint of disorder. There was an air of authority about him, but it was more from the reputation that preceded him than any true presence. His reputation was far from impeccable. Whispers followed Martin wherever he went. People talked about his short temper, his readiness to escalate situations at the slightest provocation, and his use of his badge as a shield for his arrogance. His presence in the park had a way of making people uncomfortable. Families steered clear of him, and the teenagers playing basketball took a cautious glance his way before retreating into their game, aware that any misstep could turn into an accusation. Today, as his gaze swept over the park, Martin was already on edge. The smallest disruption would be enough to trigger him. His patience was wearing thin, and his eyes darted from one group to the next, scrutinizing the crowd as if looking for a reason to assert his authority. The young girl carrying a tray of snacks would be his catalyst. Michelle, on the other hand, had no intention of being a part of this scene. She had been sitting at a picnic table nearby, enjoying a rare moment of relaxation. The weight of her FBI badge rested against her chest, but she kept it hidden beneath her jacket. There was no need to flaunt it here. Her only intention was to enjoy a quiet afternoon with friends, away from the demands of her work. She had earned her place among the parkgoers, blending in with the crowd. A simple smile and a calm demeanor made her approachable, even in a world where authority often demanded fear. But today, as she leaned back and laughed with her friends, her sense of peace was shattered by a sudden commotion. It started with a young girl, around 16 or 17 years old, who, in her hurry to deliver a tray of snacks to her friends, accidentally bumped into Officer Martin. One of the soda cans slipped from her grasp, rolling at Martin's feet, the hollow sound of metal meeting pavement ringing out through the park. "Hey, watch it." Martin's voice sliced through the air, sharp and aggressive. His words hung in the air, cutting off the laughter and chatter around them. People turned, sensing the sudden shift in energy, the tension now palpable. The girl, Ayana, froze. Her face flushed red with embarrassment as she bent down to retrieve the can. Her hands were shaking as she tried to balance the tray and avoid making the situation worse. She had never been in a confrontation like this, and the officer's aggression left her unsure of how to respond. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice barely audible. Martin sneered, his eyes narrowing as he took a step forward, closing the space between them. "Sorry doesn't cut it," he snapped, his voice colder than before. The way he loomed over her, towering like a predator over prey, only served to heighten her fear. "Show me some ID," Martin demanded, his voice dripping with authority. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Iana's heart raced as she tried to gather her thoughts. She hadn't brought her wallet with her, just a few snacks for her friends. She wasn't used to being challenged in such a way, and the sudden realization that she might be in trouble left her frozen in place. I don't have it on me," she whispered, her eyes darting around, looking for some kind of escape, but finding none. The crowd, which had been so lively moments before, had grown silent. Everyone was watching, and their eyes felt like weight, a heavy judgment hanging over her. Martin scoffed. "Figures," he muttered, his tone dripping with disdain. "Reckless and irresponsible. You kids think you can do whatever you want, don't you?" Iana's hands trembled as she tried to regain some composure. She wanted to say something, anything to diffuse the tension, but before she could open her mouth, Martin stepped forward and shoved her. The force was enough to make Iana stumble backward, her feet catching on the grass as she tried to regain her balance. The tray of snacks flew from her hands and crashed to the ground, sending chips, cookies, and cans scattering across the pavement. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and for a moment, the park fell into an eerie silence. The scene had escalated quickly, and those watching knew it wasn't just about a simple mistake anymore. Something more was happening. Something darker. Michelle's pulse quickened as she took in the unfolding scene. She had seen it before, the way a person in power could abuse their authority, making others feel small, insignificant. She had witnessed officers like Martin cross the line before, but this time felt different. This wasn't just some random act of cruelty. This was a moment where someone needed to intervene. Someone had to take a stand. Her instincts kicked in. Michelle stood up from the picnic table, her calm expression masking the fury that was boiling beneath the surface. She knew she had to act, and she couldn't afford to hesitate. "Hey!" Her voice rang out across the park, clear and commanding, cutting through the stunned silence. The crowd's attention shifted. They turned toward her, their eyes flicking back and forth between Michelle and the officer. Michelle's gaze locked onto Martin's, and for the first time that day, she saw his expression falter. His arrogant confidence wavered. "What do you want?" Martin growled, clearly unaccustomed to anyone challenging him. Michelle didn't flinch. Her voice remained steady, filled with authority. "I think it's time we have a conversation," she said, her words firm, unshaken by his intimidating stance. "You don't get to treat people like that." Her words hit like a thunderclap, and the crowd murmured, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. People began pulling out their phones, recording the confrontation, their whispers filling the air. This wasn't just a moment of injustice. It was an opportunity for something larger. Michelle stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her chest, but she was resolute. "What I see here is an abuse of power. You just assaulted that young woman, and now you're trying to intimidate her into silence. That's not how this works." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Shock rippled through the park. No one had ever stood up to Officer Martin in such a way. People shifted uneasily, unsure of what would happen next. Would Michelle back down? Would Martin escalate things further? Iana, still trembling from the shove, looked from Michelle to the officer. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had never imagined that her accidental collision with the officer would lead to this, would lead to a standoff like this. She had never imagined she would become part of something so much larger than herself. But now, in this charged moment, she realized that it wasn't just about her anymore. This was about standing up for what was right. And Michelle. Michelle was here to make sure that someone did. A clash of wills. The tension in Henderson Park was palpable, and the air felt thick with the collective breath of the crowd, holding steady in anticipation. A hush had fallen over the park, the sounds of the basketball game and chatter now distant, as the standoff between Michelle and Officer Martin took center stage. The vibrant energy that had once filled the space now seemed to freeze, as if the park itself was waiting to see how this confrontation would unfold. The sunlight, once a bright and relentless presence, now seemed to retreat behind a blanket of clouds, casting a shadow that seemed to mirror the brewing storm between Michelle and Martin. Michelle's heart raced, but her expression remained calm, controlled. This wasn't her first time standing up for what was right, but it was the first time she had found herself challenging an officer so boldly, in front of so many. The feeling of eyes on her, the judgment, the whispers, wasn't new, but today it felt heavier. Her voice had to be unwavering. She had to be the force of reason in this situation, no matter how out of control it seemed. Martin's eyes, cold and filled with an almost predatory disdain, wore down on her. His brow furrowed as his fingers twitched at his sides, like a snake preparing to strike. He wasn't used to being challenged. People didn't challenge him. They feared him. They avoided him. And those who didn't were either ignored or quickly put in their place. But this woman, this FBI agent, she wasn't like the others. She wasn't intimidated by his badge or his reputation. That threw him off, made him uneasy in a way he couldn't shake. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Martin spat, his voice dripping with contempt. He took a step forward, his imposing figure seeming even larger now that he stood toe-to-toe with Michelle. Michelle stood firm, never wavering, not even a hint of hesitation. She knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to assert dominance through intimidation, trying to remind her of his status, his position. But Michelle wasn't interested in his status. She was interested in justice, in righting a wrong. And in this moment, she knew she had to make her stand, not just for Ayanna, but for every person who had ever been silenced or overpowered by someone like Martin. "I don't care who you are," Michelle replied, her voice steady, her words cutting through the charged air. "What matters is what you just did. You assaulted that girl. You pushed her for nothing more than a simple accident." Her word hung in the air like a weight. The crowd shifted, murmurs rising from every corner of the park. Some people seemed unsure, confused, but others were nodding, their expressions shifting from one of disbelief to one of quiet support. The shift was subtle, but it was there. For the first time in a long while, the community of Henderson Park was beginning to speak up, not just with their words, but with their presence. They were no longer willing to stand by and let this abuse continue unchecked. Martin's eyes narrowed, and he took another step closer to Michelle, his chest puffing out as if to physically intimidate her. "You think you can just waltz in here and challenge me? I'm a police officer, and I'm the law in this park. You think your badge means anything here?" He sneered, clearly convinced that his power and authority were enough to silence her. But Michelle stood unflinching, meeting his glare with the same unyielding resolve. She wasn't here to back down. Michelle's voice was quiet but firm, the weight of her words cutting through the tension. "I think you've forgotten what your badge really stands for. Your badge is meant to protect, not to bully. It's meant to serve the people, not to intimidate them." Her words seemed to land harder than she anticipated. Martin's jaw clenched, his face reddening with anger. But Michelle wasn't finished. "I've worked alongside good officers, officers who understand the responsibility that comes with the badge. But you," she pointed at him, her finger steady, "you're using your power to hurt people. And I'm not going to stand by it and watch that happen, not today." The crowd, who had been silently observing, began to shift. They edged closer, inching forward, as if to affirm Michelle's words. They were no longer passive bystanders, unsure of how to act in the face of authority. They were taking a stand. Their phones were out, the cameras recording every moment, documenting the abuse of power for all to see. Some of them had been victims of Martin's arrogance before, others had seen it firsthand. Now, they were seeing someone finally push back. Ayanna, still standing at the side, her hands still trembling from the shock of the situation, looked at Michelle. Her wide eyes reflected both fear and admiration. She had never imagined her simple mistake would bring about this showdown. She was just a girl who had dropped a soda can. How could it have escalated to this? But now, watching Michelle, she realized something profound. This wasn't just about a mistake. This wasn't just about soda cans or snacks. This was about power, respect, and what it meant to stand up for yourself. But even as the crowd began to sense the power of the moment, Martin's anger was far from subdued. He wasn't just angry at Michelle. He was furious that his authority, his power, was being challenged in front of the very people he had come to dominate. He was the law in this park. He wasn't used to people looking him in the eye without fear. He took a step closer to Michelle, his body tense, ready to escalate the situation. "You want to do this here, in front of everyone." His voice was low, threatening. "You'll regret it." Michelle didn't flinch. She knew exactly what he was trying to do. He was trying to provoke her into losing her cool, trying to get her to make a mistake. But she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. She wasn't the one in the wrong here. "I'm not afraid of you, Martin," Michelle replied, her voice unwavering. "You should be afraid of what happens when people stop being afraid of you." For a moment, there was a stillness. It wasn't peaceful, but it was quiet. It was the calm before the storm, the moment of truth where the lines between right and wrong, justice and injustice, would either be drawn or blurred forever. Martin's hand twitched. It was a small movement, but it didn't go unnoticed by the crowd. Some of them instinctively took a step back, sensing that the situation was about to escalate even further. But Michelle remained rooted in place, her expression calm, as if she had already made peace with whatever would come next. In that moment, something shifted inside her. It wasn't just her resolve that solidified, but a deep understanding that this was bigger than herself. This wasn't just about standing up to a bully. This was about reclaiming what had been taken from too many people for too long. It was about showing the world that even in the face of fear, courage could stand firm. And as the wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees and lifting the tension in the air, Michelle knew that the choice had been made. She would not back down, and neither would the people who had gathered around them. This was their moment too. Michelle's next words would be the final spark. "I'm not going anywhere, Martin," she said firmly, meeting his gaze. "And neither are the people you've been hurting for so long." The crowd stirred, a quiet murmur of support rippling through them. Phones continued to record, capturing every moment, every word, and every gesture. The park that had once been so carefree now had become the stage for a battle that was bigger than one officer and one FBI agent. It was a battle for dignity, for justice, for the people who had long been silenced. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The breaking point. The air around them felt thick with anticipation, like the quiet before a thunderstorm. Martin, towering over Michelle, continued to glare at her, his eyes burning with anger and disbelief. He was used to people cowering, to them apologizing and stepping back when he raised his voice. But Michelle stood her ground, unwavering and resolute. She wasn't backing down. She had never been more certain of what needed to be done, and the stakes had never felt higher. A few feet away, Liana, the young girl who had caused the initial disturbance, stood frozen, her eyes darting between Michelle and the officer. Her heart was still racing, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had never imagined that a simple mistake, dropping a soda can, could result in such a dramatic confrontation. The force of the officer's shove still lingered in her chest, like an echo of something she couldn't quite process. But now, with Michelle stepping in, she felt a strange sense of relief. Someone was finally speaking up for her. Someone was finally standing between her and the injustice she had just experienced. The crowd had grown larger, their whispers rising in volume, but no one dared to speak too loudly. It was as though everyone understood that this moment was bigger than any of them, bigger than the park or the basketball game that had once filled the air with youthful energy. This was a turning point, a moment when power and authority were being called into question, and the tension was thick enough to taste. Michelle could feel the weight of the eyes on her, on them. Phones were raised, cameras capturing every second, every word. The social media platforms would be ablaze with the footage. People were recording not just the moment of injustice, but the moment when someone stood up and refused to let it slide. Michelle knew that what she did here could ripple far beyond Henderson Park. This could be the start of something bigger, a shift in how people viewed authority and justice. Martin's jaw clenched as he took a step forward. His presence was like a looming storm cloud, and his fists were clenched at his sides, twitching with barely contained rage. His fingers curled into tight fists, his knuckles white from the pressure. He was a man used to wielding his power, used to being in control, but Michelle had disrupted that control. And he didn't like it one bit. "Are you really going to stand there and lecture me?" Martin growled, his voice low and menacing. His tone was filled with disbelief, as if Michelle's very presence was an affront to his authority. He reached for his radio, his fingers hovering over the button to call for backup, to escalate the situation further. But Michelle saw the movement and stepped forward, her hand raised in a subtle but firm gesture. "Don't even think about it," Michelle warned, her voice cool but intense. "You can't bully your way out of this. You're not going to use your badge as an excuse to keep pushing people around." Her words hit him like a slap, and for a brief moment, Martin hesitated. He didn't expect resistance, especially not from a woman, not from an FBI agent. He had expected her to back down, to be intimidated by his size and his authority. But here she was, standing tall, unflinching in the face of his fury. Her words were not just a challenge. They were a challenge he wasn't sure he could win. This wasn't about the girl anymore. It was about his pride, his image, and Michelle had threatened both in front of the crowd. The crowd, which had once been scattered and uncertain, had now fully coalesced into a unit. They were no longer just bystanders. They were participants in this moment, and many of them, despite their earlier hesitation, were now emboldened by Michelle's courage. They had seen this before, seen the way people like Martin operated, seen how the community had been silenced for too long. But now, they could see a change happening, and they were starting to feel the power of collective action, even if it was just by standing there and watching. Michelle's mind raced, but her exterior remained calm. She knew that she was walking a fine line. The situation could escalate at any moment. One wrong move, one wrong word, and this entire park could descend into chaos. But she also knew that she couldn't back down. She had to hold her ground, not just for herself, but for the people who had suffered under Martin's tyrannical approach for far too long. "You don't get to decide who gets to feel safe here," Michelle said, her voice cutting through the tension with a sharp clarity. "You don't get to push people around because you're wearing a badge. That's not what it's for." Martin's face twisted into a snarl, his nostrils flaring with anger. He stepped forward again, his height and physicality meant to intimidate, but Michelle didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She stood her ground, her shoulders squared, her jaw set, and in that moment, something within Martin seemed to snap. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he hissed, his words laced with venom. "I've been on the force for over 15 years. I've put people like you in their place, and I'll do it again if I have to." Michelle met his gaze unflinchingly. "I've dealt with people like you before, Martin. People who think their badge makes them untouchable. It doesn't. And today, you're going to find out that no one is above the law." The words hung in the air, a challenge that neither of them could back away from. For a long moment, there was only silence, a charged silence that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. The crowd was completely still, every single person waiting for the next move, for the next words. It was as if the park itself was holding its breath. Finally, Martin sneered and turned his back on Michelle, his footsteps heavy as he walked away, his rage barely contained. He muttered something under his breath, words no one could quite hear, but the crowd could feel the shift. It was a victory, but it wasn't over yet. The damage had already been done, and the tension in the air was still thick with the fallout from the encounter. Michelle watched him walk away, but she didn't feel relief. Not yet. She knew that Martin might leave for now. But his influence wasn't gone. He still held power over the park, and he still carried the weight of his badge. But today, for the first time, Michelle had seen the cracks in that power, and the community had too. "Are you okay?" Michelle turned to Ayanna, her voice gentle now as the young girl stepped forward, her eyes still wide with a mixture of shock and awe. Ayanna nodded, though her hands were still trembling. I didn't know what to do," Ayanna admitted, her voice small. I didn't think anyone would help me." Michelle smiled, her expression softening. "You don't have to be alone in this. No one should have to be." The crowd began to disperse slowly, though many of them lingered, talking quietly among themselves, sharing their own stories of similar experiences with Martin. Some people seemed emboldened, others still too afraid to speak out, but Michelle knew that the seeds had been planted. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning. The park, once a place of tension and fear, had just witnessed a turning point. And while Michelle knew there would be more battles to fight, she also knew that this one was a victory for accountability, a victory for standing up for what's right. As she watched the crowd filter back into their daily lives, Michelle couldn't help but feel the quiet ripple of change starting to take shape. The ripple effect. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the trees, casting long shadows across the park. The golden hour had arrived, but the atmosphere was anything but serene. The echoes of the confrontation still lingered, buzzing in the air like a hornet's nest disturbed by an intruder. Michelle stood near the picnic table, watching as the crowd slowly began to disperse. But she knew that this moment, this brief confrontation, was far from over. It had only just begun. She could feel the eyes of the people around her. Some were still holding their phones, their screens flickering with footage of the event, but many others were watching her, studying her. It wasn't the first time she had dealt with a situation where authority figures abused their power, but it was the first time she had challenged one in such a public, confrontational way. And now there was no turning back. The eyes of the community were upon her, and they were waiting. "You did good," a voice broke through her thoughts. Michelle turned to find an older man with graying hair standing nearby. His face was weathered, his eyes soft but knowing. He was one of the regulars in the park, someone who had seen far too many confrontations, far too many moments where the system failed the people who needed it most. "I didn't do it for praise," Michelle replied quietly, glancing around. "But thank you." The man nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at his lips. "Doesn't matter what you did it for. You did it, and that's enough." The words were simple, but they struck Michelle with the weight of truth. She had acted out of instinct, out of the deep-set belief that what she had witnessed was wrong, and it had been her duty to act. But in doing so, she had opened a door to something much bigger than herself, something that had the potential to change the landscape of the community. She could feel it now, like the air was charged with the possibility of what might come next. As the man walked away, Michelle's gaze swept over the park. It had been a peaceful place only hours before, filled with laughter and the sounds of basketball games. But now it seemed marked by something else, a quiet undercurrent of unease. People still lingered, standing in small groups, whispering to one another, sharing their thoughts on what had just unfolded. Many had never seen an officer challenged in such a way. Others had always known the truth but had never felt empowered to speak up. Today, something had shifted, and the ripples of that shift were beginning to spread. Michelle's phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She pulled it out to see a text from her partner at the FBI. "Derek, we need to talk. Something's going down. Meet me ASAP." A knot formed in Michelle's stomach. She didn't have to ask what it was about. The situation with Martin was only one part of a much larger issue that had been brewing in the background for months. She had known for some time that the corruption within the police department ran deeper than just isolated incidents. It was systemic. And though she had taken the step to challenge one officer, she knew that the real battle would be fought at the higher levels, where the roots of this problem were firmly planted. But that was a fight for another day. Michelle turned back toward Ayanna, who was still sitting on the edge of the picnic table, nervously picking at her fingers. The young girl had been through so much in such a short time, and Michelle could see the uncertainty still written on her face. It wasn't just the physical shove that had affected Ayanna. It was the emotional toll of being targeted, belittled, and humiliated in public. The kind of trauma that ran deeper than a scraped knee or a bruised arm. It was the kind of injury that stayed with a person long after the moment had passed. "Are you sure you're okay?" Michelle asked gently, taking a seat next to Ayanna. "I know that was a lot." Anna hesitated for a moment, her eyes welling with unused tears. "I'm just confused," she admitted, her voice quiet. "I've never had something like that happen before. I didn't know what to do. I never thought I'd be in a situation where I needed to stand up to a cop." Michelle nodded, understanding. "Most people don't, and that's the problem. It's not about you being brave or standing up to someone when you don't want to. It's about knowing that you don't have to just take it. You don't have to accept that kind of treatment. You deserve better." Anna sniffled, wiping her eyes. "I never thought anyone would stand up for me. But you did. Why?" Michelle looked at her, her eyes softening. "Because I know what it's like. I've seen it before. And because sometimes we have to stand up for each other. That's how we change things." Ayanna looked at Michelle, her expression one of quiet admiration. She had seen people, even adults, get pushed around by officers like Martin. Her own family had been victims of this kind of treatment before. But today, Michelle had shown her that there was another way, that even in the face of intimidation, it was possible to speak out, to demand justice. As they sat in the park, the sound of distant sirens and traffic filled the background, but Michelle knew that the real noise was happening inside her head. The events of the day would have repercussions, and she wasn't sure exactly what they would be. But as she looked around at the people who had witnessed the confrontation, she realized that something had changed. The seeds of resistance had been planted, and now it was up to the people to decide how they would water them. Later that night, Michelle's mind raced as she sat across from Derek in the dimly lit coffee shop. She hadn't had time to process everything that had happened earlier in the park. There was still a nagging sense of urgency, the feeling that everything was about to escalate. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, as if she were standing on the edge of something far bigger than just one incident. Derek looked grim as he took a sip of his coffee, his eyes narrowing. "I don't think you fully grasp what this is yet, Michelle. That confrontation at the park, it's got people talking. But not just in the park. Word's spreading. There's already been chatter about Martin. His colleagues are pissed. They don't like anyone challenging him." Michelle's eyes sharpened. "I didn't do it for the attention. I did it because it was the right thing to do." "I know. But it's about more than just Martin. There's a network, Michelle. A lot of officers are involved. Some of them are dirty. We're talking about systemic corruption here." Michelle's stomach dropped. She had suspected as much. But hearing Derek confirm it made her realize the enormity of what they were up against. This wasn't just a bad cop. It was an entire system that needed to be dismantled, one brick at a time. "We need to move carefully," Michelle said, her voice low and determined. "This isn't just about Martin anymore. It's about exposing the entire network." Derek nodded. "You're right. But we need more than just courage. We need evidence. We need to make sure we're not walking into a trap." Michelle leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant as she thought about the task ahead. It was going to take everything she had: courage, patience, and the support of the community she had just begun to inspire. As the light outside the window dimmed further, Michelle's resolve hardened. She was ready for the battle ahead, knowing that every fight for justice, no matter how small it seemed, was worth it. The ripple that had started in Henderson Park wasn't going to stop here. It would spread, and the impact would be felt long after the sun had set on this day. The hidden struggle. The days following the confrontation at Henderson Park seemed to stretch on forever. Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, something big. The attention had shifted away from the incident itself, but the ripple effect continued to expand. People were talking. The whispers had turned into discussions, and the discussions had turned into action. Michelle's phone buzzed relentlessly throughout the week, but most of it was routine work from the FBI, investigations into local crimes, background checks, and follow-up interviews. But every now and then, a message would pop up that felt more urgent than the rest. Sometimes from Derek, sometimes from an unknown number, sometimes just a passing comment from someone who had witnessed the incident in the park. They were all watching. They were all waiting for the next move. The pressure was mounting. By Thursday, Michelle had received an anonymous tip about a hidden meeting that was taking place. It wasn't directly related to Martin or the corrupt officers, but it was part of something bigger, something that ran deeper than even Michelle had anticipated. A small part of her had hoped that this was just an isolated incident, that Martin's behavior was just a rogue example of abuse of power. But deep down, she knew better. The truth was staring her in the face. This wasn't just one bad cop. It was a network, a web of corruption that reached into every corner of the department. The longer she sat with the thought, the heavier it felt. There was more at stake now than just a community event gone wrong. This was systemic, and Michelle was going to expose it. But to do so, she needed information. She needed evidence, and she needed the right people on her side. That night, after another long day of covert surveillance and sifting through hours of footage from body cameras and social media, Michelle met with Derek again at their usual spot, a small, dimly lit diner on the edge of town. The kind of place where the food was forgettable, but the conversations were important. Derek was already there when she arrived, his face tense. He gestured for her to sit down and slid a manila folder across the table. "I got something for you," he said, his voice low. "And I think it's the break we've been waiting for." Michelle opened the folder, scanning through the documents inside. There were names, a list of officers, dates, and something else, a series of meetings that had been taking place at odd hours, meetings with known gang members, suspected criminals, and even politicians. The connections were undeniable. "This is it," Michelle said quietly, her eyes scanning the list. "This is the network." Derek nodded. "They've been running operations under the radar for years. But what's more troubling is how deep it goes. The corruption goes all the way to the top. Some of these names, they're untouchable." Michelle's blood ran cold. The names on the list were familiar. Some were officers she'd worked with in the past. Others were higher-ups in the department, their faces hidden behind the authority of their positions. The thought that they had been complicit in something so sinister for so long was almost too much to bear. But she couldn't afford to let her emotions cloud her judgment. Not now. "So, what's the next move?" Michelle asked, her mind already racing through the possibilities. Derek's expression was grim. "We need to move carefully. These people have power. And they've been covering their tracks for years. We can't go in guns blazing, Michelle. We need a plan. A solid one." Michelle leaned back in her seat, the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. She had always known that fighting for justice wasn't easy, but this was different. This wasn't just about standing up to an officer in the park. This was about dismantling an entire criminal network, one that was rooted in the very system meant to protect the public. There was no easy way out of this. "We'll need more than just this list," Michelle said after a long pause. "We need proof. Something that connects these people to the crimes they've been covering up." Derek nodded. "I'm working on it. But it's not going to be easy. The longer we wait, the more they'll cover their tracks. We have to be fast, and we have to be smart." Michelle felt a flicker of doubt. How could she possibly take down something so massive? But then she remembered the young girl, Ayanna, who had been shoved by Martin in the park. She remembered the fear in her eyes, the way she had hesitated when Michelle had offered her support. She remembered the power of that moment, the moment when she stood up for what was right, not out of fear, but out of necessity. "Derek," she said, her voice firm now, "we can do this. We have the evidence we need. We just need to take the next step." The tension builds. The next few days were a blur of activity. Michelle and Derek continued to gather information, meeting in secret locations, poring over hours of surveillance footage, and tracking down leads. They knew they couldn't waste time. Every minute counted. The network they were up against was vast, and the people involved weren't going to go down without a fight. By Friday afternoon, they had a lead. One of the officers on the list, a man named Officer Turner, had been acting suspiciously. His movements had been tracked for days, and it was clear that he had been meeting with individuals who were not only connected to the criminal underground, but had links to other high-ranking officers within the department. Michelle's instincts told her that Turner was the key to the entire operation. He was the one who would lead them to the heart of the corruption. But as they prepared for the next phase of the operation, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She had been through enough covert investigations to know the signs. Someone was onto them. She had to be extra cautious, especially now that they were so close to uncovering the truth. Late that night, as Michelle and Derek finalized their plans, a familiar sound echoed in the distance, the unmistakable screech of sirens. It was happening. The moment they had been preparing for had arrived. The fight for justice wasn't just a matter of standing up against one corrupt officer. It was a battle against a system that had been corrupt for far too long. And Michelle knew that this fight would be unlike anything she had ever faced. The question now was, would she be able to take it down before it destroyed everything she stood for? The final stand. The air had never felt heavier than it did that Saturday evening. As the streetlights flickered to life along the narrow side streets, casting long shadows across Michelle's path, she felt a strange sense of clarity. The kind of clarity that comes only after all the planning, all the sacrifices, and all the uncertainty finally narrowed down to a single defining moment. She had always known that her work wasn't going to be easy, but this was the culmination of everything she'd worked for, everything she'd fought for. And this fight wasn't just about the corrupt officers she had uncovered or the layers of criminal activity she had peeled back. It was about something far bigger, the justice system itself. The very institution that should have been protecting the people had become a breeding ground for corruption. This was the moment Michelle knew she had to either expose it all or risk watching it swallow more innocent lives. Derek met her at the diner just after sundown. His usual easy demeanor was absent, replaced by a palpable tension in his shoulders, and the lines etched deep into his face. His eyes darted nervously around the room before finally landing on Michelle. "It's all set," he said quietly. "I've got confirmation on Turner's meeting tonight. He's meeting with his contacts, the ones on the list. This is it. We can finally put an end to this." Michelle nodded, but the weight of what was about to happen sat heavily on her chest. "You're sure? No slip-ups?" Derek gave a quick, sharp nod. "Everything's lined up. You get Turner's confession. We hit the whole network tonight. I've arranged for backup, but we'll need to move fast." Michelle's thoughts raced. Turner was the key, and they couldn't afford to wait any longer. If they hesitated, they'd risk giving him and the others the time they needed to cover their tracks, or worse, destroy any evidence they had gathered. "I'll do it tonight. I'll be in position," Michelle said firmly, her voice leaving no room for doubt. Derek hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching hers as if gauging whether she fully understood what she was about to do. The danger wasn't just physical. There were too many people involved. Too many high-ranking officials who would stop at nothing to cover their tracks. The minute they struck, they would be putting themselves in the crosshairs of not just the corrupt officers, but their allies within the system. It was a massive risk. But Michelle was ready. The night felt unusually quiet as Michelle parked her car a few blocks from the rendezvous point. The street was deserted, save for a few scattered cars and the faint hum of the city's nightlife in the distance. She made her way toward the alleyway where she was supposed to meet Turner, blending in with the shadows as she walked. Her mind was sharp, every step measured, every instinct alert. The last few days had led to this point, and there was no room for mistakes. As she neared the alley, she heard the sound of voices, low murmurs punctuated by the occasional laughter. Turner's group was waiting for him, unaware that tonight their operation would be exposed. Michelle adjusted her jacket, making sure her FBI badge was tucked securely inside, and stepped forward into the darkness. Turner was standing in the center of a circle of men, all of them exchanging what appeared to be small packets of money and briefcases. Michelle stayed back, her position offering a clear view of the exchange. She needed proof, clear, undeniable evidence. But just as she took a step closer, the atmosphere shifted. A sudden noise, a car engine revving, split the air. Michelle froze. The backup team should have been on their way by now. Why weren't they here? Before she could process the thought, a figure appeared from the shadows. Derek. "Michelle," he whispered urgently, "we've got a problem." Someone tipped them off. The backup's compromised. The hairs on the back of Michelle's neck stood up. The realization hit her like a freight train. Turner wasn't just meeting his contacts tonight. He was making a deal with them to cover their tracks, and they knew exactly what was coming. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. "Where's the backup?" Derek's jaw tightened. "It's a setup, Michelle. Someone's playing us." The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, her instincts screaming at her to move. They were outnumbered, and now they had to think on their feet. The plan had changed. The showdown. As the situation spiraled into chaos, Michelle made a split-second decision. She couldn't back down now, not after everything they'd worked for. The network was too deep, the stakes too high. She needed to act, and she needed to do it quickly. She turned to Derek. "Get to the car. I'll handle this." Derek opened his mouth to protest, but Michelle was already moving forward, slipping further into the alley, her footsteps barely audible against the gravel. She could feel the tension rising, the moment hanging in the air, suspended between life and death. She had only one chance to do this right. She drew her weapon as she neared the circle of men. Turner's eyes met hers first, and for a brief moment, he looked surprised. But then his expression hardened. "You shouldn't have come here, Michelle," he said, his voice cold and controlled. "This doesn't concern you." Michelle's heart raced, but she kept her composure. "You're wrong," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. "This concerns everyone. The lives you've ruined, the people you've betrayed. Tonight, it ends." She took another step closer, her gun trained on Turner as the men around him began to stir. "Drop the weapons. Now." There was a tense silence before Turner's laugh cut through the air. "You think you're in control here? You're alone, Michelle. No one's going to help you." Michelle's grip tightened on her weapon. "I don't need anyone else. Just you." A slow, deliberate smirk crept across Turner's face. "You'll regret this." Before Michelle could react, Turner lunged toward her, his hands aiming for the gun. She sidestepped, her body moving instinctively as she fired a warning shot into the air. The men around them froze, but Michelle didn't hesitate. She wasn't about to give him the chance to overpower her. With one swift motion, she aimed and fired, hitting the ground just inches from Turner's foot. "Stay down," she shouted. "I said drop the weapons." The group scattered as the sound of the gunfire echoed through the alley. Michelle didn't wait to see where they went. She knew the plan was to escape through a series of escape routes, hidden pathways only they knew. But she was ready for this. She was prepared. As Turner fell to the ground, clutching his shoulder, the weight of the situation suddenly seemed to pause in that moment. Michelle stood over him, her gun still aimed at his chest. "I don't want to kill you, Turner," she said, her voice calm yet resolute. "I just want to make sure you can never hurt anyone again." The aftermath. By the time the backup arrived, it was over. Turner was in custody, and the rest of his associates had scattered into the night. Michelle didn't need to chase them. She had what she came for. The evidence was in her hands, the proof of their crimes and the network of corruption. Turner would talk, and the rest would come crashing down with him. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the first domino had fallen, and Michelle knew that the investigation was far from complete. The corruption she had uncovered was just the beginning. There were still others out there, others who would fight tooth and nail to protect their empire. But as Michelle stood there, watching the squad cars pull into the alleyway, A feeling of satisfaction washed over her. She had done it. She had exposed the rot that had festered in the shadows, and now the truth would come to light. The road ahead would be long, and the battle far from over. But for the first time in a long while, Michelle felt like justice was no longer a distant hope. It was a real possibility, and she would be there, every step of the way, to make sure it was served.